狩猟からのお言葉だ。いい未来だろう。
15 pages. That's all it took to resurrect every dead character, undo every sacrifice, and reset an entire timeline. Tokyo Revengers spent 5 years and 278 chapters convincing you that loss was permanent. But then, in its final chapter, the author pressed Ctrl-Z on all of it. There even is an interview published in the same issue as the finale that proves he planned it that way from the very start. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a manga that sold 80 million copies delivered one of the most universally rejected endings in modern anime, and why Season 4 almost certainly won't fix it.
Mikey 君ならこんなのへでもねえよ。ダメ人間だ。
Ken Wakyui didn't come from the manga industry. He came from the streets, expelled from school as a teenager, ran with gangs, and eventually worked in kabukicho bar shifts before he ever picked up a pen. His first series, Shinjuku Swan, ran for 8 years and earned its own live-action film. But Tokyo Revengers, which launched in Weekly Shonen Magazine in March 2017, was different because it was personal. Takemichi Hanagaki could leap through time to save the people he loved, but every leap came with a cost. Deaths stuck, choices rippled forward, and the people you watched die? They stayed dead. That was the contract Tokyo Revengers made with its audience. By 2020, it had already earned the Kodansha Manga Award for it, but it was the anime's spring 2021 premiere that turned it into a phenomenon. Within a year, the manga went from 2.3 million copies in circulation to 40 million, handing Kodansha its biggest manga sales year since Oricon started tracking and spawning the highest-grossing live-action film in Japan that year. And the series spread everywhere, because the stakes felt real. Most people will tell you the ending ruined Tokyo Revengers. That's not wrong. But the real story is that the ending didn't break the contract. The author just never intended to keep it. By the time the Tenjiku arc wrapped at chapter 185, Kisaki was gone and Hinata was saved. For most fans, that was the ending, but for Wakyui, it wasn't even close. And everything after that point was borrowed time.
聞き込みに行ってくるわ。君らここで待っててくれる。ごめんね。おい、こらてめえ。
聞き込みっていうか、拷問。
待ってくれ。話するだけだから。天竺のアジト、分かったぞ。乗り込むよ。
Wakyui kept going, and he kept going for 93 more chapters. And the story ran from chapter 186 all the way through 278, bringing in 3 brand new gangs in its last act: Brahman, Rokuhara Tandai, and the Kanto Manji gang. A major new character, Senju Kawaragi, showed up in a narrative that had already said its goodbyes. Meanwhile, where earlier arcs spent months building new factions and earning the audience's investment, they arrived compressed, underdeveloped, and fighting for space in a story that was already running out of room. But the franchise had become too profitable for anyone to pump the brakes. In a single fiscal year, Tokyo Revengers moved over 24 million copies, the biggest year any manga had ever given Kodansha, beating the record Attack on Titan, set back in 2013. So this was now the publisher's most valuable property, and it was still climbing. But whether Wakyui kept going out of creative ambition or commercial obligation, the result was going to be the same. Because while the money kept flowing, the readers kept mourning characters the author was always going to bring back. They just didn't know it yet. And nobody paid a higher price for the compression than Draken, Mikey's right hand since childhood and the emotional anchor of Toman. The kind of character who felt untouchable because the story seemed to need him standing. So his death in the Three Deities arc became the single biggest fan grievance before the ending ever dropped. a character so beloved killed in a way that felt unearned, and sacrificed to raise the stakes of an arc that would eventually render his death completely meaningless. And at the time, fans were furious. What they didn't know yet was that furious was going to feel like an understatement. By the time the anime caught up to this stretch of the story, it only made things worse. LIDENFILMS produced Seasons 2 and 3 of Tokyo Revengers across 2023, and both were widely panned for slideshow fight sequences, static poses, and off-model character designs so bad that fan petitions started circulating online demanding a studio change. So the anime that made this manga a phenomenon couldn't even hold up to a pause button. Think about what that means. A franchise worth 80 million copies in print, a live-action film, stage plays, a theme park attraction, all of it built on the back of an anime that couldn't even put together a fight scene that actually moved. So the money was flowing everywhere except back into the craft. But the declining animation, the rushed arcs, the thinning story, none of it would have prepared the fans for what the last 3 chapters were going to do.
お前はすげえな。タケミッチは俺のヒーローだ。俺が時代を作ると思ってたんだけどな。
The Kanto Manji arc reached its climax when present-day Mikey stabbed Takemichi during the final gang war. As Takemichi bled out in Mikey's arms, something happened that the series had never once established was possible. Both of them got hurled back in time. Not to weeks earlier, not to the beginning of the story, but to September 1998, a full year before the original timeline's first tragedy ever occurred. And somehow, both of them retained their future memories, even though they'd woken up as 7-year-olds in the first grade. And what followed was a montage that spanned approximately 15 pages. They saved Izana and rescued the Shiba family. Koko Nui's tragedy was averted before it started. House fires prevented and cycles of abuse broken before they began. Every death, every sacrifice, and every consequence across the entire series, all of it undone in a handful of panels. And the final page? Takemichi and Hinata's wedding. The entire cast is present, everyone alive, everyone smiling, bouquet tossed. The end! That shared time leap just contradicted every rule the story had spent years establishing. Because for the entire run, only Takemichi could leap, triggered by a handshake with Naoto Tachibana, sending him back exactly 12 years from the present. So when Mikey's tears on Takemichi's hand somehow sent both of them backward together, launched from the past instead of the present, it didn't feel like a twist. It felt like the rules had stopped mattering, and the character arcs didn't survive the landing either. Chifuyu and Pa Chin, who had fought their way out of gang life across multiple arcs, were dragged back in to serve the reset. Hanma's motivations and backstory were never resolved, and his final panel was a bizarre, borderline fourth wall break that clarified nothing. And then there was Draken, whose death had gutted the fanbase just chapters earlier. Quietly brought back by the timeline wipe, making his sacrifice not just painful, but retroactively pointless. This was supposed to be the culmination of a 5-year story about whether you can change the past without losing yourself in the process. But what it actually felt like was a save file reload. No cost, no wait, just a clean slate handed to characters who were never asked to earn it. And the backlash was near universal. Fans called it the worst manga to do it. And where Attack on Titan's divisive ending split its community down the middle, Tokyo Revengers united its fan base, just not in the way Wakayui intended. So when Season 3 of the anime released, it was near silence. And the outlets attributed the collapse in interest directly to the manga's finale, poisoning the well for anime-only viewers who'd read ahead. The series held a 7.72 on MyAnimeList, but that number was carried almost entirely by the strength of its first 100 chapters. But here's the detail that should sit with you longer than any of that. Back when the final chapter dropped in November 2022, Weekly Shonen magazine ran a long interview with Wakayui in the same issue. And in it, he stated clearly that the ending's concept had already been decided during the Bloody Halloween arc. When Baji died, Wakayui had already resolved to bring him back to life. So every death the readers mourned across the entire series was staged grief. Wakayui wrote loss so convincingly that millions of people carried it with them for years. And he did it while knowing from the very start that he was going to take it all back. The ending wasn't rushed, not a mandate from editorial, not a cancellation forced by declining sales. It was simply the plan. And that is what makes this one of the worst endings in anime. Not because the author failed his story, but because he succeeded at something his audience never agreed to.
黒い衝動滝道もうお前とは二度と会うことはないだから最後に言っておく
Season 4, War of the Three Titans, premieres October 2026 on Disney+. This time with a new director Maki Kodaira and a new photography director replacing the one behind the flat visual quality of seasons 2 and 3. LIDENFILMS is still the studio, but the internal production team has been overhauled, and fans want to believe that would matter. The precedent they keep pointing to is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which corrected a botched first adaptation and became the gold standard for anime do-overs. But that comparison collapses on Contact, because Brotherhood was a complete reboot, announced up front as a ground-up readaptation with the manga now finished. While Tokyo Revengers Season 4 isn't that. It's a continuation of the same production line, with zero public statement suggesting any divergence from the source material. Even the timing works against them. Because Season 4 picks up where Tenjiku left off, at Chapter 186. But the arc it's named after doesn't even begin until Chapter 207. The controversial reset lives in the final 3 chapters, 276 through 278, which means this season probably doesn't come anywhere near the ending. And the fix fans are hoping for isn't just unconfirmed, it might not even be in scope yet. And even if there's a Season 5 down the line, there might not be an audience for it anymore. The hype collapse around Season 3 wasn't just a reception problem, it was a commercial signal. The engine that drove 80 million copies has stalled, and this might be the last season. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the franchise doesn't have the viewers left to justify another one. But even if the runway existed, the problem runs deeper than 3 chapters. The reset isn't a detachable ending bolted onto an otherwise functional story. Everything from Chapter 186 forward is built on the architecture that produces it. Every new gang, every death, every escalation in the Kanto-Manji conflict feeds directly into the climax that triggers the time leap. Fixing the ending doesn't mean rewriting 15 pages, it means restructuring everything this season is about to adapt. Then there's Wakyui himself. No statement of regret, no acknowledgement that anything went wrong. He considers this the story he always intended to tell. And an author who doesn't believe the ending is broken is never going to sign off on a rewrite. Tokyo Revengers isn't a story that fell apart at the finish line. It's a story where the finish line was always a reset button. And the author spent 5 years making sure you didn't see it coming. The Fall 2026 anime is the last real shot at giving this franchise the ending it earned. But nobody has promised that ending is coming. And if Wakyui's interview tells us anything, nobody involved thinks there's anything to fix. Tokyo Revengers wasn't the only franchise that got stretched past the point it should have ended. But that's a story for next time.